A woman learns the weight of her own name the first time someone tries to sell it. Clara Hayes kept that thought behind her teeth as the silver tag around her wrist caught the candlelight and flashed a number that was not hers. 7. Not Clara. Not Hayes. Not daughter of a woman who had once braided her hair by the kitchen stove and told her that a name was the last thing the world could take if you refused to hand it over. Just 7, stamped into cheap silver and tied to her with a ribbon that looked almost gentle from a distance. She told herself her hand was shaking because the room was cold. It wasn't. The court cellar beneath Westmere Hall had no windows, but it was crowded enough to hold the heat of bodies, wool coats, damp leather boots, and old money. Rain had followed everyone inside, clinging to hems and shoulders, turning the air sour with wet stone and polished oak. Somewhere above them, the formal courtrooms held clean desks, framed charters, and men who said words like justice without tasting them first. Down here, beneath the floorboards, justice had a ledger, a starting price, and a clerk who dipped his pen without looking at the girls whose futures he was recording in black ink. Clara stood on the small platform with 6 other women, all dressed in plain gray gowns that had been taken from the same storage chest and altered badly by hands that did not care where seams rubbed or fabric pulled. Her gown was too loose at the shoulders and too tight at the ribs, and it smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and someone else's fear. She had said nothing when they gave it to her. Unclaimed omegas did not correct people. They did not ask where their own clothes had gone. They did not ask why a debt that belonged to a dead guardian had become a chain around a living woman's wrist. They stood where they were placed, lowered their eyes when instructed, and learned the shape of every exit they were not allowed to use. Malcolm Creed stood beside the clerk with one gloved hand resting on the auction book as if it were a family Bible. He was smiling, but not warmly. His smile had the thin, polished patience of a man who had explained cruelty to himself so many times it had started to sound like policy. Lot 7, he said, and the room shifted with interest. Clara felt it before she saw it, that small lean of attention, the way people became sharper when they were allowed to inspect someone who could not inspect them back. Female Omega. 21 years old. No active pack claim. No verified bloodline of consequence. No legal guardian remaining. Suitable for domestic alliance, settlement transfer, or protected household placement. Protected. The word landed softly and still managed to bruise. A man near the front lifted his chin, his eyes moving over her as if she were a horse at market. Another whispered something to the woman beside him, and she hid her mouth behind a lace glove. Clara looked past them, past the candles, past the clerk's ink-black fingers, to the old map hanging crookedly on the far wall. Most of the territories were marked in gold thread, proud names stitched into green and brown cloth. But one region near the northern ridge had been covered by a square of dark fabric, sewn on with thick black stitches. It looked like a wound someone had tried to make tidy. Clara's throat tightened before she knew why. Her mother had once sung about a place beyond the ash trees, a place whose name always vanished before the last line of the song. Clara had been 6 the first time she asked why the song stopped there. Her mother had gone so still the kettle screamed for a full minute before she moved to lift it from the stove. Never say old names in rooms with new flags, she had whispered. Clara had not understood then. She was beginning to understand now. Malcolm turned a page. We will begin at 200 crowns. The number passed through the room like a door closing. Clara folded her fingers around the edge of her sleeve to keep from touching the tag again. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her fight a ribbon. She would not cry over a number. She would not let her face become another item in their ledger. Then the door at the back of the cellar opened, and the room changed before anyone spoke. Not loudly. Not suddenly. It changed the way air changes before a storm reaches. The windows, pressure first, sound second. The whispers thinned. A chair leg stopped scraping against the floor. Malcolm Creed's smile faltered for less than a heartbeat, but Clara saw it, and for the first time that morning, fear moved to someone else's face. The man who entered did not hurry, and somehow that made the room feel smaller. He wore a dark coat still jeweled with rain at the shoulders, the fabric plain enough that another man might have looked underdressed among brokers and council buyers, but no one in Westmere Hall mistook plainness for weakness when it belonged to Ronan Vale. Clara had heard his name the way children in border kitchens heard thunder, distant, certain, and powerful enough to make grown people lower their voices. Alpha King was not decoration in his case. It was not a title embroidered for ceremony or polished for court dinners. It was a fact the room accepted before he had crossed half the floor. 2 guards followed several paces behind him, but Clara understood at once that they were not the source of the silence. Ronan carried it with him. His eyes moved across the cellar, not quickly, not lazily, but with the careful attention of someone trained to notice what other people hoped would remain beneath notice. They passed over the buyers, the clerk, the auction book, Malcolm Creed's gloved hand, the platform, the silver tags. When they reached Clara, they did not soften. That should have relieved her. Pity would have been unbearable. Instead, his expression remained controlled, almost cold, and for one strange second Clara felt less displayed than she had all morning, because he looked at her as if she were not the point of the room's entertainment, but evidence of something incorrectly filed. Malcolm recovered first. Men like him always recovered quickly when power entered the room. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with the smoothness of a man who had practiced respect until it could hide resentment. "We were not informed the Crown intended to attend a settlement transfer." Ronan did not look at him immediately. He looked at the silver ribbon around Clara's wrist. The silence stretched until the clerk's pen gave one nervous tap. "Against the inkwell." "I was not informed," Ronan said at last, his voice low enough that everyone leaned toward it without meaning to, that settlement transfers had become bride markets beneath court property. Malcolm's smile tightened. "The language is informal, of course. These are lawful debt resolutions. Each woman here has been reviewed according to registry standards." "Registry standards," Ronan repeated, and the words sounded colder in his mouth. Clara watched Malcolm's thumb press once against the edge of the auction book. There was ink on the glove, a small black smear near the seam. She should not have noticed it. She noticed everything. Fear had a way of sharpening the useless details. "Lot 7, the clerk said faintly, as though the room needed reminding of where it had left off. Malcolm gave him a look so swift it almost vanished. Ronan finally turned to the clerk. "Her name." No one answered. The pause was small, but it opened like a crack in ice. Clara felt every eye return to her tag, to the number that had replaced her. Malcolm cleared his throat. "The subject has no verified name requiring preservation under transfer law. Her guardian's debts dissolved the household claim. She may be recorded under the purchaser's designation." Subject. Purchaser. Designation. The words arranged themselves around Clara like a box being nailed shut, each one clean, official, and empty of mercy. Her mother's voice stirred somewhere behind them, quiet as a hand smoothing hair from a fevered forehead. "A name is the last thing the world can take if you refuse to hand it over." Ronan's gaze moved from Malcolm to Clara. "What is your name?" It was the first question anyone had asked her all day that was not meant to reduce her price. Clara's mouth felt dry. Speaking seemed suddenly more dangerous than silence, not because he had asked harshly, but because the answer belonged to her. "Clara Hayes," she said. Her voice did not shake as much as her hands had. Ronan held her gaze for one breath longer, then turned back to the clerk. "Record Clara Hayes under Crown protection." Malcolm's expression changed, barely. A thin bright line of alarm passed beneath the polish. "Your Majesty, with respect, Crown protection is not a purchase category. If you wish to place a bid, the opening price has already been announced." Ronan reached into the inside of his coat and withdrew a folded document sealed in black wax. He placed it on the clerk's table with 2 fingers. "That is a royal seizure order for unlawful transfer risk, signed this morning. The debt will be paid to the lawful creditor. The broker's fee will be reviewed by council auditors. The woman leaves with me." The room became so still Clara could hear rainwater dripping from the hem of someone's coat onto the stone floor. Malcolm looked down at the seal, then up again, and for the first time his smile forgot how to return. There is a complication, he said carefully. Her status is bridal, not labor. If she leaves without a binding, the prior claims may be challenged before sunset. Ronan's jaw shifted once, the only sign that the words had landed. Clara did not understand the law, but she understood traps. She had lived inside one long enough to recognize the shape of another. Ronan looked at the stone arch near the far wall, the one draped in faded white cloth for transfers that wanted to pretend they were ceremonies. When he spoke, his voice had no warmth in it, only decision. Then prepare the binding record. Clara's breath caught before she could stop it. Ronan did not look pleased. He looked as if he had just accepted the weight of a locked door because leaving it closed would crush someone on the other side. The faded cloth over the stone arch had probably been white once. Now it held the color of old paper, softened by dust, smoke, and years of ceremonies no one remembered with tenderness. Clara looked at it while the clerk hurried to rearrange the transfer table into something that could pass for a marriage station, and she wondered how many women had stood beneath it pretending the room was not a cage because the law preferred prettier words. Binding. Alliance. Protection. Household placement. Every word sounded cleaner than being sold, and none of them changed the way her wrist still carried the silver tag. Malcolm Creed stood close enough for Clara to smell the sharp spice of his glove polish. He did not speak to her, not directly. That was almost worse. He spoke around her, over her, through documents and procedures, as if she had already become paperwork. The Crown understands, he said to Ronan, that a protective binding, once entered, creates public expectation. There will be political questions. Ronan had removed his wet coat and handed it to one of his guards. Without it, he looked less like a visitor and more like the reason the room had foundations. His black shirt was plain, fastened at the throat with a small iron clasp shaped like a wolf's head, and when he turned, the candlelight cut along the hard line of his cheek without warming it. There were political questions the moment a woman was numbered in a court cellar, he said. No one answered that. The clerk placed a narrow strip of blue binding cord on the table. It was not bridal silk. It was emergency cord, the kind used when law mattered more than celebration. Clara knew that because one of the women beside her made a tiny sound, quickly swallowed. Clara did not look back. If she did, she might remember that leaving with Ronan meant leaving others behind, and the guilt of survival was too heavy to pick up while she was still trying to stand. Ronan stepped beneath the arch first. He did not reach for her. He did not command her closer. He simply stood there with his hands at his sides, waiting, as if time belonged to him and he could afford to spend some of it on her choice, even if the choice was thin as thread. Malcolm leaned toward her. "Do not embarrass yourself," he murmured. Clara looked at the silver tag one last time. Then she walked forward. Each step sounded too loud on the stone. The room followed her with its eyes. She felt the crooked seam of the gray dress rub against her shoulder, felt the damp chill at the hem where rainwater from other people's boots had touched the platform, felt the old fear in her chest trying to make itself useful by becoming numb. She would not let it. Numbness had kept her quiet for years. It had never kept her safe. When she reached Ronan, he looked down at her wrist. "Remove it," he said. The clerk blinked. "Your Majesty, the tag is required until the binding is complete." Ronan did not raise his voice. "Her name has been recorded. Remove it." The clerk fumbled with the ribbon. Clara held still while the silver tag slipped away from her skin and landed on the table with a small, ordinary sound. It should not have felt like anything. It was cheap metal. It had been on her wrist for less than a day. Still, the place beneath it seemed to breathe. The elder called from the back office was old enough that his hands trembled when he opened the binding book, but his eyes were alert. He read the legal phrases without ornament. Ronan Vale, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, accepted temporary marital claim and household protection over Clara Hayes, pending full council review of her status and prior debts. Clara heard the word temporary and felt it settle between them. Not wanted. Not chosen. Protected. There was kindness in that, perhaps, but kindness could be cold. When the elder asked for the exchange of hands, Ronan turned fully toward her. Only then did his expression change, not softening exactly, but becoming careful. He held out his hand, palm up. Not gripping. Not taking. Offered. Clara looked at it for one breath, then another. His hand was broad, marked by old pale lines near the knuckles, steady in a way that made her own fingers feel young and uncertain. She placed her hand in his. His skin was warm. The fact startled her more than it should have. The cord looped once around his wrist, once around hers, then across both palms. The elder spoke the final words. A murmur moved through the cellar, restrained but hungry. Malcolm stared at the cord as if it had cost him more than money. Ronan released Clara the moment the law allowed, but not as if he was eager to be free of her. More as if he understood that being held without permission had already filled too much of her day. Clara Hayes leaves under my protection, he said. Anyone who contests that will do so before my court, not beneath it. Clara should have felt relieved. Instead, as the cellar door opened and cooler air rolled down the stairs, she looked once more at the covered place on the old map. The black stitches seemed darker now, almost deliberate. Something about them pulled at a memory she did not want to touch, a half-finished lullaby, her mother's hand over her mouth, a warning spoken beside a dying fire. Never say old names in rooms with new flags. Clara followed Ronan toward the stairs, carrying her own name like a candle in both hands. Outside Westmere Hall, the rain had softened to a fine silver mist, the kind that made every lantern glow larger than it was. Clara stood beneath the covered entrance with her hands folded at her waist, feeling the absence of the tag more sharply than she had felt its weight. The skin around her wrist still held a pale mark where the ribbon had pressed, and she kept her thumb over it as if the place might open if she stopped guarding it. Ronan spoke briefly with his guards near the carriage, his voice too low for her to catch, but every man listening stood straighter afterward. No one asked Clara whether she wanted a cloak. One simply appeared over her shoulders, dark wool, warm from being kept near the carriage stove, smelling faintly of cedar smoke and winter air. She looked toward Ronan, but he was already turning away, giving orders about the road north, the council notices, the broker's records. He did not look like a man who had just married. He looked like a man who had interrupted a mistake and now had to carry the consequences across 40 miles of wet road. Clara told herself that was fine. Wanting had ruined better women than her. Protection was a roof. Protection was a locked door between her and Malcolm Creed. Protection was not tenderness, and she would be foolish to confuse the two. The carriage ride to Vale Court took most of the afternoon. Through the rain-blurred window, Clara watched the city thin into stone walls, then farms, then dark pine ridges rising like folded cloth against the gray sky. Ronan rode ahead on a black horse instead of sitting inside the carriage with her. That should have made her feel dismissed. Instead, she found herself grateful for the space to breathe without having to decide what expression belonged on the face of a woman accidentally bound to a king. By the time the road curved through the iron gates of Vale Court, twilight had settled across the estate. The keep was not beautiful in any gentle way. It rose from the hillside in black stone and narrow windows, built less like a palace than a promise that nothing unwelcome would pass through twice. Torches burned along the outer wall, their flames bending in the wind. Servants gathered in the entry hall before Clara stepped inside, and the silence that met her was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of a household receiving the wrong woman. She saw it in the flowers first. White roses and red winterberries climbed the banister in expensive ribbons. A silver tray near the stairs held place cards written in elegant ink. Vivian Cross. Lady Vivian Cross. Future Luna Vivian Cross. The name repeated itself in small polished pieces across the hall, on folded menus, on a ceremonial guest list, on a velvet box left open to show ruby earrings that caught the firelight like drops of sunset. Clara stood there in her plain gray dress and borrowed cloak, damp at the hem, and understood with perfect clarity that a life had been prepared here, just not hers. An older woman with iron gray hair approached and gave a careful bow. "I am Mrs. Alder, house steward of Vale Court. His Majesty has ordered a room prepared for you in the West Wing." Not the Luna chamber. Clara did not need anyone to say it. As Mrs. Alder led her through corridors smelling of beeswax, pine ash, and old stone, Clara passed an open doorway where women were quietly removing crimson gowns from a carved wardrobe. One of them looked up too quickly, then looked away. The room Clara received was small but warm, with a fire already lit, a pitcher of hot water on the washstand, a plate of bread, apple slices, and chicken soup covered with a white cloth. There were no jewels, no roses, no ruby earrings. But the sheets were clean, the lock was on the inside, and someone had placed a folded nightgown at the foot of the bed without perfume or lace or any suggestion that she was meant to become decorative by morning. Clara touched the edge of the soup bowl and found it still warm. That was when her throat tightened. Not in the cellar. Not under the arch. Here, because warmth asked nothing from her. Mrs. Alder paused at the door. His Majesty said you are not to be questioned tonight. No one is to enter unless you give permission. If anyone forgets that instruction, you may ring this bell. She set a small brass bell on the table. Clara looked at it, then at the closed door after Mrs. Alder left. For the first time all day, she was alone. She removed the borrowed cloak slowly and laid it over the chair. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, not crying, not yet, and listened to the distant movement of a household rearranging its future around the girl it had never expected to receive. By morning, the rain had stopped, but Vale Court still held the weather in its walls. The corridors smelled of wet pine, warm stone, and smoke from fires fed before dawn. Clara woke before the house bell, sitting upright before she remembered where she was, one hand already reaching for a silver tag that was no longer there. For a moment, the absence frightened her more than the thing itself had. Then she saw the locked door, the untouched soup bowl from the night before, the brass bell on the table, and the folded note beside it in Mrs. Alder's narrow handwriting. Breakfast will be sent when you ring. Council luncheon at noon, if His Majesty requires your presence. If. Clara read the word 3 times. It was a small word, but small words had changed her life before. By noon, she had washed, braided her hair, and put on the only dress provided, a plain blue wool gown that fit better than the gray one but still made no claim of ceremony. It was not beautiful. That steadied her. Beauty in a place like this could be mistaken for an invitation to be judged. Plainness gave her somewhere to hide. Mrs. Alder came for her just before the clock struck 12 and led her through a gallery lined with portraits of serious men, pale women, and black wolves painted so carefully their eyes seemed to follow every breath. At the end of the gallery, double doors opened into the council dining room. Clara had expected a table. She had not expected an audience. 12 council members sat beneath high windows, their plates arranged before them in perfect silver order. Ronan sat at the head of the table, dressed in black, one hand resting beside an untouched glass of water. To his right sat a woman Clara recognized without being introduced. Vivian Cross looked exactly like the name that had filled the entry hall the night before, elegant, composed, dressed in deep red with pearls at her throat and not a single thread out of place. Her smile when Clara entered was gentle enough to be praised by anyone not standing beneath it. Mrs. Vale, Vivian said. The title moved through the room like a spoon striking glass. Clara felt it land on her shoulders, too heavy and too new. Ronan's eyes lifted to Vivian, and the smile thinned slightly before she looked down at her plate. Clara Hayes, Ronan said, correcting the room without raising his voice. She will be addressed by her name until she chooses otherwise. Clara did not look at him. Gratitude was dangerous when offered too quickly. She took the empty seat halfway down the table, not near Ronan, not near Vivian, exactly where someone had decided a temporary wife belonged. The first course was soup with white beans and herbs. Clara picked up her spoon and tried to remember how quietly respectable people ate when they were being measured. The questions began before the soup cooled. A silver-haired elder named Marlowe asked where she had been born. Another asked which guardian had held her documents. A third wanted to know whether she could read household accounts, whether she had worked in service, whether any healer had ever registered her wolf status. Each question wore manners like gloves. Each answer Clara gave was short, careful, and true only where truth was safe. She had been born near the northern border. Her mother had died when Clara was 14. Her last guardian had kept few papers. She could read, write, mend, cook, and keep inventory. She did not know why her registry was incomplete. Vivian dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "How unfortunate," she said softly. "A woman without records is so easily misunderstood." Clara set her spoon down without a sound. Ronan had not eaten. He watched the room more than he watched her, which made her wonder what he expected to happen. At the far wall hung a larger version of the old territory map from Westmere Hall, cleaner, newer, and framed in dark wood. Gold thread marked the living packs. Silver marked Crown roads. One northern section was covered in black ink, not cloth this time, a smooth deliberate stain where a name should have been. Elder Marlowe followed her gaze. "Dead territory," he said. "Best not to study empty places, child. Nothing good ever came out of that ridge." The words reached Clara before caution did. She heard her mother's lullaby, low beside a kitchen stove, heard the missing final line rise like a bird startled from the dark. Clara did not mean to speak. That was what frightened her most. The name left her mouth quietly, almost tenderly. That was Ashbourne. The room stopped. Not conversation. Not movement. The room itself seemed to stop, as if every candle had forgotten how to lean and every breath had been collected by an unseen hand. Vivian's fingers closed around her napkin. Elder Marlowe went pale in a way no polite question could explain. Ronan stood so slowly that his chair made no sound at all. His eyes were no longer cold. They were fixed on Clara with a focus that made the rest of the room disappear. "Who taught you that name?" he asked. Clara realized, too late, that some names did not enter a room as sound. They entered as evidence. Every face at the council table had changed in a different way, but all of them had changed. Elder Marlowe looked down at his hands as if they had suddenly become unfamiliar. Vivian Cross kept her chin lifted, yet the pearl at her throat moved with each careful swallow. One of the younger councilmen reached for his water glass and missed it by half an inch. Ronan did not move from the head of the table. He only watched Clara, and the focus in his eyes made her feel as if the floor beneath her chair had quietly fallen away. "My mother," Clara said. The answer sounded small in the large room. "She used to sing it." Vivian gave a soft laugh that did not survive the silence around it. "Children misremember songs. Border villages collect old nonsense the way barns collect dust." Ronan did not look at her. Let her speak. Clara's fingers curled once against the napkin in her lap, then loosened. She could feel every lesson of her childhood fighting with the words in her throat. Do not correct powerful people. Do not offer what they did not ask for. Do not say old names in rooms with new flags. But she had already said it, and the name could not be placed back behind her teeth. "It was a lullaby," she said. "About ash trees, a ridge, and a moon hidden under black snow. My mother always stopped before the last line. When I asked why, she told me never to say old names in rooms with new flags." That was when Ronan's eyes lowered, not to her face, but to the iron clasp at his own throat. The black wolf sigil caught the noon light. Clara saw him make the connection at the same moment she did. Her mother had not only warned her about flags. She had warned her about him, or someone who wore what he wore. The realization moved through Clara slowly, colder than fear because it had shape. She had been brought into the house of the very symbol she had been taught to avoid. "Did she tell you anything else?" Ronan asked. His voice was controlled, but something under it had tightened. "Not anger." "Not exactly." Clara wished she knew him well enough to name what it was. "Only pieces," she said. She said some names were buried because they were guilty, and some were buried because they knew where the guilt was kept. No one breathed loudly enough to be blamed for it. Elder Marlowe closed his eyes for 1 second too long. Vivian set her napkin beside her plate with perfect care. "This is absurd," she said. "A girl from an incomplete registry repeats a nursery rhyme, and we are treating it like testimony." Ronan finally looked at her. A nursery rhyme just named a territory removed from every public map 70 years ago. Vivian's color did not leave all at once. It faded carefully, as if even her fear had been trained in etiquette. Ronan turned to the guard near the door. "Seal the council room. No one enters or leaves without my order." The guard bowed and stepped outside. The click of the door closing was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Clara sat very still. She had not been locked in, she told herself. She had been protected. The difference mattered. It also did not feel large enough. Ronan gave another order. "Send for the royal archivist. Bring the pre-revision charters, the ridge maps, and the sealed index from the lower vault." Elder Marlowe's eyes opened. "Your Majesty, those records are restricted for Crown review only." "Then it is fortunate," Ronan said, "that the Crown is reviewing them." The elder looked away first. Clara should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt the old room of her childhood around her, the warm stove, the kettle beginning to scream, her mother's hands suddenly covering her mouth with a fear Clara had not understood. She understood more now, but not enough to be safe. Ronan came around the table slowly and stopped several feet from her chair, far enough that she did not have to lean back. That distance, more than anything else, unsettled her. He was dangerous, but not careless. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time her name had sounded like a question rather than a correction. "Did your mother leave you anything? A paper, a mark, an object with that name attached to it?" Clara thought of the small cloth pouch sewn inside the lining of her old traveling dress, the one Malcolm's women had taken from her before the cellar. She thought of the silver pendant her mother had pressed into her palm at 14, warm from her own skin, shaped like a crescent moon resting in ash-colored leaves. She had hidden it because hiding was the only inheritance she had understood. Across the room, Vivian's gaze sharpened, too quick and too bright. Clara saw it and knew, with a quietness that frightened her, that the pendant mattered. "Yes," Clara said. Ronan's expression did not change, but the room did. "Where is it?" he asked. Clara looked toward the closed door, toward the long road back to Westmere Hall, toward the life that had been stripped from her and boxed away by strangers. "They took it with my clothes," she said. "Before they put the tag on my wrist." The room did not erupt after Clara spoke. That was the strange thing. Nothing dramatic happened, no shouted accusation, no overturned chair, no immediate confession from the faces that had gone too still. Instead, the council dining room became careful. Careful was worse. Careful meant everyone understood that a door had opened somewhere under their feet, and no one yet knew how far the stairs went down. Ronan sent 3 orders within 1 minute. One guard rode back to Westmere Hall for Clara's belongings. Another went to the lower vault for the sealed index. Mrs. Alder was called to sit with Clara until the archivist arrived, not because Clara had asked for comfort, but because Ronan seemed to understand that being surrounded by powerful strangers could make even warm rooms feel like cellars. Clara sat with her hands folded around a cup of tea she did not drink. The cup was fine white china painted with black pine branches, so delicate that her fingers looked almost too ordinary against it. Vivian watched the cup, then Clara's hands, then the door, as if measuring how quickly a small object could ruin a large family. No one mentioned the luncheon growing cold. The soup formed a pale skin in the bowls. Butter softened beside untouched bread. Through the tall windows, the last of the morning clouds moved off the ridge, leaving the world too bright for what was happening inside. The royal archivist arrived shortly after, a narrow woman named Helena Pike with silver spectacles, ink on her cuff, and the expression of someone who trusted paper more than people. 2 attendants followed her with a long iron box that required separate keys from Ronan and Elder Marlowe. Marlowe looked older when he handed his key over. Not weaker, exactly, but less certain that age could protect him from the past. Helena opened the box on the cleared end of the table. The smell that rose from it was dry leather, old dust, and something faintly sweet, like pressed flowers left too long between pages. She removed 3 books, each bound in cracked black hide, and a flat folder sealed with gray wax. Pre-revision charters, she said. Northern Ridge maps. Bloodline registries from the year before the Ashbourne removal. Clara heard the name spoken by someone else and felt a small shock move through her. It sounded different when it was not a lullaby. It sounded like a place that had once paid taxes, planted fields, signed treaties, buried its dead, and expected to be remembered. Helena laid the oldest map over the newer one hanging on the wall. The room leaned in despite itself. On the old parchment, the dark-stained region was not empty. It was full of careful markings: a chapel, a ridge road, a spring, a watchtower, a crescent-shaped hall drawn near the edge of a pine forest. Above them, in faded brown ink, was the name Ashbourne Pack. Under it was a smaller line Clara could not read from her seat. Ronan could. His face changed, not much, but enough that Clara saw the moment history stopped being abstract to him. "Read it," he said. Helena adjusted her spectacles. Custodians of the Moon Covenant. Elder Marlowe made a sound so soft it might have been breath. Vivian stood. "Old ceremonial language," she said quickly. Many dead packs gave themselves pretty titles. Helena did not look at her. "This is not ceremonial. The covenant mark appears beside royal succession records." She opened the bloodline registry and turned the pages with careful fingers. Ashbourne was not listed as rebel territory in the original index. It was listed as protected witness territory. The words moved through the room with quiet force. Protected witness. Clara did not fully understand them, yet her body did. Her mother had not been hiding a shameful name. She had been hiding a dangerous truth. The door opened then, and the guard from Westmere returned carrying a plain brown bundle tied with cord. Clara recognized the worn blue fabric of her traveling dress before he placed it on the table. For 1 second, she could not move. That dress had been hers in a way nothing at Vale Court was hers. It held the shape of roads walked alone, kitchens slept beside, winter mornings survived without complaint. Mrs. Alder untied the bundle gently and found the inner lining where Clara pointed. The cloth pouch was still there, sewn so neatly no careless hand had noticed it. Clara took it herself. The pendant slid into her palm, cool silver warmed almost instantly by her skin. A crescent moon rested inside ash leaves, just as she remembered. Helena's breath caught. Ronan stepped closer, but not too close. Clara placed the pendant on the old map because some part of her knew where it belonged. It fit exactly over the crescent hall. A hidden clasp inside the pendant clicked, and a tiny folded strip of vellum slipped free. On it, in faded ink, was one line: "The true Luna line survives where the ash remembers." Vivian's chair scraped back. This time, everyone heard it. The scrape of Vivian's chair faded before anyone moved. She had risen only halfway, one hand on the table, her eyes fixed on the slip of vellum as if the ink itself had spoken against her. Then she sat back down with the slow grace of someone remembering that panic was also a confession. Clara kept her palm near the pendant but did not close her fingers around it. All her life, she had hidden that small silver thing under seams, under mattresses, under the ordinary fear of being searched. Now it lay in the open beneath 12 Council stairs and the Alpha King's shadow, and it looked less like jewelry than a key that had been waiting for a room brave enough to admit it was locked. Helena Pike bent over the vellum, careful not to touch it until Ronan nodded. "The ink is old," she said. "The fold pattern matches emergency witness notes from the last succession dispute." Elder Marlowe's mouth tightened. "That does not prove the girl understands what she carries." Clara looked at him then. Not boldly. Not with the kind of defiance people applauded in stories because they did not have to survive afterward. She looked at him because something inside her had gone very quiet, and in that quiet, memory arranged itself like stones across water. "There is more," she said. Ronan turned fully toward her. "More from your mother?" Clara nodded once. The song did not only have the name. It had directions. Vivian made another small sound, quickly covered by the soft touch of her napkin to her lips. Ronan heard it. So did Clara. She had spent years being underestimated in kitchens, corridors, and back rooms. She knew the sound of someone recognizing danger before anyone else did. Helena brought fresh paper. Clara did not reach for the pen. If she wrote the words, they would look too fragile. If she spoke them, she could hear whether they still belonged to her mother's voice. Past the ridge where the black pines lean, she said slowly, down where the winter spring cuts under stone, 3 steps before the chapel door, asked the ash what the moon was owed. The council room remained silent, but not empty silent. This silence was crowded with calculation. Ronan walked to the old map and studied the markings near the crescent hall. There is a chapel shown here, he said. Helena traced the parchment without pressing. Old St. Rowan's. Officially abandoned after the removal. The road was erased from later surveys. Not erased, Clara said before she could soften it. Hidden badly. Ronan looked at her, and for the first time since Westmere, she saw something near approval in his expression. Not warmth exactly. Respect, perhaps, new and unfamiliar enough that she did not know where to place it. Within the hour, they left Vale Court through the north gate. Ronan ordered horses, 2 guards, Helena, and no council escort. Vivian was told to remain in the house. She accepted the order with a smile so perfect it made Clara's skin feel cold. The ride to the ridge was 5 miles over wet ground, past fields rimmed with melting frost and pines dark enough to turn noon into evening beneath their branches. Clara rode a small brown mare Mrs. Alder had chosen for steadiness, and Ronan kept his horse half a length behind hers, not ahead. It unsettled her more than command would have. Kings did not usually follow women in borrowed blue dresses toward places removed from maps. At the winter spring, Clara heard the song before she recognized the path. Water moved under a lip of stone, clear and cold, making the same 3-note sound her mother used to hum while kneading bread. Clara dismounted. One of the guards moved forward, but she raised a hand without thinking. He stopped and looked to Ronan. Ronan looked to Clara. That was the moment the ground shifted between them. He had soldiers, charters, seals, and a name that made rooms fall silent. But here, among wet pine needles and old ash roots, he did not know where to step. Clara did. No one goes ahead of me, she said. Her voice sounded strange in the trees, stronger than it felt inside her. If the song is right, the 3rd stone is not for anyone without ashborn blood. Elder Marlowe would have questioned her. Malcolm would have laughed. Vivian would have called it superstition with silk in her voice. Ronan only nodded. Then lead. The chapel appeared between the trees like a memory that had survived out of stubbornness. Its roof sagged, its door was gray with weather, and ash leaves lay gathered on the threshold though no ash tree grew close enough to drop them there. Clara counted the stones. 1. 2. On the 3rd, the pendant warmed against her palm. Not hot, not frightening, only alive in the way a coal remembers flame. She whispered the last line her mother had never sung aloud until the night before she died. The moon was owed a witness. Beneath the chapel door, something clicked softly, like a lock deciding it had waited long enough. The chapel door did not swing open. It loosened, just slightly, with a sigh of old wood and hidden iron, as if the building had been holding its breath for 70 years and had finally been given permission to exhale. Clara stood with her hands still around the pendant, listening to the soft underground movement that followed the click. Stone shifted somewhere beneath the floor. Dust slipped from the frame above the door in a pale curtain. One of the guards reached instinctively for the latch, but Ronan lifted one hand, and the man stopped before touching it. Clara, Ronan said. Not a command. Not a warning. Her name, placed carefully into the cold air between them. She understood what he was asking. Are you certain? She was not. Certainty belonged to people who had been told the truth early enough to build a life around it. Clara had been given fragments, lullabies, a pendant hidden in a hem, and a mother who had gone quiet whenever riders passed too close to their cottage. But the stone beneath her shoes knew her. The silver in her palm knew her. The last line of the song had opened a door no royal key had touched. That would have to be enough. She pushed the chapel door with both hands. Inside, the air smelled of ash, dry leaves, and sealed paper. Thin daylight entered through broken panes high in the wall, falling across rows of empty benches and a simple altar made from gray stone. Behind it, where a painted moon had faded almost to nothing, a narrow stairway descended beneath the floor. Helena Pike whispered something that sounded like a prayer but might have been an archivist's shock at finding a record exactly where it had no right to be. Clara went first. Ronan followed 2 steps behind, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him without feeling crowded by it. The stairway was short, only 12 steps, ending in a chamber no larger than a pantry. Iron shelves lined the walls. Boxes sat in careful rows, each marked with a crescent and ash leaf seal. No treasure glittered there. No crown waited on velvet. Only names. Books and ledgers, witness statements, birth records, council letters, transfer papers, maps folded into oilcloth, all the quiet things powerful people feared more than swords because paper remembered what mouths were paid to forget. Helena opened the first ledger with trembling care. By the 3rd page, her face had gone very still. By the 5th, Ronan had stopped looking at Clara and started looking at his own kingdom as if seeing a crack run through its foundation. "Read it aloud," he said. Helena swallowed. Ashbourne Pack was assigned protective custody of the Moon Covenant line after the Northern Succession Challenge. Their removal was not a rebellion record. It was a concealment order filed under emergency authority. She turned another page. Signed by Lord Elias Cross and Council Broker Malcolm Creed I. Clara heard the Cross name and thought of Vivian's pearls moving with each nervous swallow. Helena continued, her voice lower now. Surviving female descendants were to be reclassified as unclaimed where possible, their records separated, their names absorbed through marriage, debt, or domestic transfer. Clara sat down on the bottom step because her knees had become unreliable, and she refused to fall in front of history. Her mother had not been poor. Because the world had forgotten her. The world had been instructed to forget her. Ronan took the ledger, not from Helena's hands but after she offered it, and read in silence. When he looked up, the coldness in his face had changed into something cleaner and more dangerous, not rage, not spectacle, but judgment settling into place. They returned to Vale Court before dusk with 3 sealed boxes in the carriage. No one spoke much on the road. Clara held her mother's pendant in one hand and a copied registry page in the other. Her mother's name was there, Mara Hayes of Ashbourne Witness Line, relocated under protective disguise. Not nameless. Not accidental. Not nobody. At Vale Court, the council had already gathered again, drawn by rumor, fear, and the knowledge that silence was no longer protecting them. Vivian stood near the hearth, dressed in the same red gown, but the color seemed less like power now and more like a curtain pulled over a window. Malcolm Creed had arrived from Westmere under royal summons, his glove seems perfect, his smile gone. Ronan placed the first ledger on the council table. He did not shout. He did not need to. For 70 years, he said, women were stripped of records, sold through debt law, and renamed for convenience because 2 families feared what their bloodlines would prove. Malcolm looked at Clara then, truly looked, and she saw the exact moment he understood that the girl he had called Lot 7 had returned carrying the room he had buried. Clara stepped forward before anyone could speak for her. Her hands were cold, but the paper did not shake. She placed the copied registry page beside the ledger and pointed to her mother's name. "My mother had a name," she said. The words were not loud. They did not have to be. They moved through the chamber with more force than any accusation because they were simple, true, and impossible to fold back into silence. The council chamber did not become merciful after Clara spoke. Mercy would have been too simple, too clean for a room that had benefited from careful silence for longer than most of its members had been alive. What changed first was posture. Elder Marlowe sat back as if the chair beneath him had lost its shape. Vivian Cross stood motionless near the hearth, one hand at the pearls on her throat, her face arranged into calm so tightly it looked painful. Malcolm Creed stared at the ledger, then at Ronan, then at Clara, searching for a crack in the moment wide enough to step through. He found none. Ronan did not ask the council what should be done. Clara understood then that there were kinds of power that needed applause, and kinds that only needed to decide. The cross-claim to Luna Review is suspended, he said. Vivian's lips parted, but no sound came out. All Creed transfer contracts from the last 20 years will be frozen by royal order. Every woman entered as unclaimed through debt settlement will have her birth record reviewed by the archivist's office. Any name removed from registry law will be restored. Malcolm's hand tightened on the back of a chair. Your Majesty, that would overturn hundreds of lawful placements. Ronan looked at him with a stillness so complete the room seemed to step away from it. Then hundreds of lawful placements were built on a lie. No one defended Malcolm after that. Not because the council had suddenly grown brave, Clara thought, but because the paper on the table had made cowardice less profitable. Helena Pike gathered the ledgers with the reverence of someone carrying bones from an unmarked field. Mrs. Alder came to stand near Clara, not touching her, simply close enough that Clara did not feel alone inside the stare of the room. That small kindness nearly undid her. Not the records. Not the testimony. Not even seeing her mother's name made official again. It was the nearness of someone who expected nothing from her grief. Ronan turned to Clara only after the orders had been written, sealed, and witnessed. The temporary binding cord from Westmere had been placed on the table beside the ledger, its blue fibers darkened from the rain and the long day. He picked it up and held it carefully, as if it were not a symbol of claim but a question. Clara Hayes of Ashbourne witness line, he said, and the sound of it moved through her like warmth returning to a room long shut. You were brought under my name because the law left you no safer door. That law is being corrected. You do not owe me a marriage for doing what should have been done before you were born. The chamber listened. Clara wished, suddenly and fiercely, that her mother could have heard it. Ronan laid the cord in her open palm. You may leave Vale Court with royal protection. You may remain here as a guest. Or, when you are ready, you may decide what this bond means. No one else will decide it for you. Clara looked down at the cord. It weighed almost nothing. Choice, she discovered, could be lighter than ribbon and heavier than iron. She did not answer him that night. Instead, she asked for Ashbourne Hall to be restored before winter, for its chapel records to be copied into the Royal Archive, and for every unnamed woman found in the Creed ledgers to receive notice by spring. Ronan agreed to all of it before the council could calculate the cost. Months passed. Snow came early to the northern ridge, softening the ruined roads and covering the black pines in white. Ashbourne Hall was not grand when the first hearth was lit again. Its roof still needed work, the western wall still smelled of wet stone, and half the windows were covered with oiled cloth against the cold. But there was bread in the kitchen, blankets in the storage room, names carved into a new wall of pale ashwood, and women arriving with folded papers in their hands and disbelief held carefully behind their eyes. Clara stood there on the first evening of spring, her mother's name beneath her fingertips, listening to the house breathe around her. Ronan came without a crown, without counsel, without ceremony. He waited by the open door until she turned. This time, when he offered his hand, it was not under a cellar arch, not in front of buyers, not because the law had cornered her into survival. Clara looked at the hall behind her, at the names restored, at the fire burning steady in a place meant to be forgotten. Then she placed her hand in his, not as a debt, not as a rescue, but as a choice she had finally been allowed to make.